The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Standing there in front of 12 ranch hands, my father's voice boomed across the dusty yard. "You're too weak to handle this ranch, Teddy. You'd ruin everything if you ever tried." The men shifted uncomfortably, avoiding my eyes. Some studied their boots. Others pretended to be busy with their tools. My face burned with shame and anger. Dad stood there with his arms crossed, his weathered face showing no regret for humiliating me in public. At 24, I thought I'd earned some respect. I'd worked these fields since I could walk, learned every inch of our 3,000-acre spread. But to him, I was still the scrawny kid who couldn't lift hay bales like the older hands. The injustice of it made my hands shake. Here I was, college-educated in agricultural science, and he still saw me as worthless. The ranch hands began to disperse, murmuring among themselves. I caught sympathetic glances from a few, but most just walked away. Dad turned his back on me and headed toward the main house. That's when I made my silent promise. I'd prove him wrong, no matter what it took. That night, I lay in my narrow bed in the bunkhouse, staring at the ceiling. Sleep wouldn't come. Dad's words played over and over in my head. The humiliation burned worse than any physical pain I'd ever felt. But somewhere in that fire, something else grew. Determination. I wouldn't waste time arguing with him or begging for another chance. Actions spoke louder than words, and I'd let my actions do the talking. I pulled out my laptop and started researching. There had to be a way to prove myself, to show him I wasn't the weak failure he thought I was. The clock on my nightstand read 2:47 a.m. when I finally found what I was looking for. A small plot of land 3 miles down the road had been abandoned for years. The owner lived in the city now and might be willing to rent it cheap. It wasn't much, maybe 50 acres of overgrown pasture and broken fencing. But it was a start. I bookmarked the property listing and closed my laptop. Tomorrow, I'd make some calls. If Dad thought I was too weak for his ranch, I'd build my own. What Dad didn't know was that I'd been preparing for this moment for years. While he stuck to the same methods his father had taught him, I'd been studying modern ranching techniques. Online courses, agricultural journals, sustainable farming practices, I'd absorbed it all. I understood soil composition, rotational grazing, and water management systems that could triple productivity. I knew about drone technology for monitoring livestock and apps that tracked weather patterns down to the acre. Dad called it fancy college nonsense, but I'd seen the results on other progressive ranches. The knowledge burned inside me, unused and unappreciated. Every suggestion I'd made over the years had been dismissed with a wave of his hand. "We've always done it this way," he'd say. If it was good enough for my daddy, it's good enough for me. But the old ways weren't working anymore. Our profits had been declining for 3 years straight. The neighboring Benson Ranch, run by a young couple using modern techniques, was thriving while we struggled. I'd watched them implement precision agriculture and sustainable practices, doubling their yield per acre. Now I'd have my chance to prove these methods worked. The next morning, I approached Dad by the equipment barn. He was checking the oil on our ancient tractor, the one that broke down every other week. "Dad, I need to borrow some tools," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just some basic equipment for a small project." He didn't even look up from the engine. "Don't waste my time, Teddy. You'll only embarrass yourself." The word stung, but I pressed on. "I found some land to rent. I want to try something small-scale, prove I can handle responsibility." He straightened up and wiped his hands on a greasy rag. "You want to play farmer? Do it on your own dime and with your own tools. I'm not financing your fantasy." The hurt went deeper than I expected. After everything I'd done for this ranch, all the years of labor and loyalty, he wouldn't even lend me a shovel. But as I walked away, I heard footsteps behind me. Buck Wilson, one of our oldest hands, caught up with me. "Kid," he said quietly, glancing around to make sure Dad wasn't watching. "Meet me behind the south barn after dinner. Bring your truck." The Henley place looked worse than the photos online. 50 acres of tall weeds, rusty barbed wire hanging loose from rotting fence posts, and a sagging barn that hadn't seen paint in decades. Old machinery sat scattered around the property like metal skeletons, slowly being claimed by rust and wild vines. Most people would have seen a disaster. I saw potential. Buck had loaded my truck with tools that Dad would never miss: old shovels, wire cutters, a manual post hole digger. "Don't tell nobody where you got these," he'd said with a wink. Now, standing in the middle of what would become my proving ground, I felt both overwhelmed and excited. The morning sun revealed the scope of work ahead. Every fence post needed replacement. The barn required major repairs. Weeds grew taller than my head in some places. But as I knelt down and grabbed a handful of soil, my heart jumped. The earth was dark and rich, loaded with nutrients. Years of neglect had actually benefited the land, allowing it to rest and recover. With proper management, this soil could outproduce Dad's overworked fields. I rolled up my sleeves and got to work. 2 weeks of backbreaking labor later, I had cleared a 5-acre section and planted my first crop. I'd chosen vegetables over cattle for now, faster return on investment and less startup cost. The rows of tomatoes, peppers, and squash looked small and vulnerable in the vast field, but they were mine. Every plant had been carefully placed according to companion planting principles I'd learned in my agricultural science courses. I'd installed a drip irrigation system using recycled materials, maximizing water efficiency while minimizing waste. The local farmers market had 3 vendors interested in buying organic produce if I could deliver quality and consistency. It wasn't much, but it was a start. My back ached from dawn to dusk work, and my hands were covered in calluses, but I'd never felt more alive. Each day brought visible progress. The plants grew stronger, the soil showed improved structure, and my confidence built with every small success. Then Mrs. Jackson from the farmer's market called with news that made my heart race. "Teddy, I've got a restaurant chain asking about local organic suppliers. They want to meet next week." This could be the break I needed. The storm hit on a Tuesday night with the fury of an angry god. I watched from my truck as hail the size of golf balls pummeled my crops. Lightning turned the sky white every few seconds, revealing the destruction happening in slow motion. By morning, half my vegetables were ruined. Shredded leaves and broken stems littered the muddy ground like a battlefield. I stood in the wreckage, fighting back tears of frustration. 3 weeks of work destroyed in one night. When I drove past Dad's ranch on my way home, he was standing by his mailbox. He saw my muddy clothes and defeated expression and couldn't resist twisting the knife. "Told you you weren't cut out for this," he called out with a smug smile. "Maybe now you'll come back to reality." The anger that surged through me was white-hot and pure. Instead of breaking me, his mockery forged something harder inside my chest. I looked him straight in the eye and said, "I'll rebuild stronger." That afternoon, I was back at the Henley place, salvaging what I could and replanting the damaged rows. Failure wasn't an option anymore. It was fuel. While I worked to rebuild my crops, I started noticing things about Dad's operation that I'd overlooked before. The ranch hands whispered about declining yields and increasing costs. Feed bills were mounting while cattle prices stayed flat. Dad's refusal to adapt modern techniques was catching up with him. Our neighbor Benson had installed solar panels and automated feeding systems, cutting his overhead by 30%. Meanwhile, Dad still insisted on doing everything the way his father had taught him. I overheard Buck talking to another hand about how Dad had been meeting with the bank more frequently. "Money's getting tight," Buck said, not knowing I was listening. "Old man's too proud to admit it, but we might be in trouble." This information changed everything. While Dad saw me as a threat to his pride, I was actually his potential salvation. My modern techniques weren't just theory, they were necessity. The ranching industry was evolving, and operations that refused to change were dying slow deaths. I began documenting everything I was learning on my small plot, knowing that someday this knowledge might save the family ranch. But first, I had to prove it worked. The restaurant buyer arrived exactly on time, driving a silver SUV that looked expensive enough to feed a small town. Carson Wells was his name, and he represented a regional chain of farm-to-table restaurants looking for reliable organic suppliers. As we walked through my rebuilt crops, I explained my sustainable practices and quality control measures. He nodded approvingly at the drip irrigation system and took notes about my integrated pest management approach. "Impressive setup for such a small operation," he said. "You've got the fundamentals right." We were finalizing details when Dad's truck pulled up to the fence line. My stomach dropped as I watched him get out and stride toward us. "You the buyer?" Dad asked Wells, completely ignoring me. "I'm the one you should be dealing with. My boy here is just playing around. I run the real operation down the road." Wells looked confused as Dad launched into a sales pitch about his ranch, bad-mouthing my work in the process. "This little garden plot? It's a hobby. You want serious volume and reliability, you come to me." I stood there, humiliated again, watching Dad try to steal my opportunity. But Wells surprised me. "Actually, I'd like to see both operations. How about we tour your place tomorrow?" Wells toured Dad's ranch the next morning, and I could see his disappointment from across the pasture. The outdated facilities, inefficient feed systems, and obvious maintenance issues didn't impress him. When Wells returned to my plot that afternoon, his attitude had completely changed. "Your operation is small, but it's professional," he said. "Your father's place, well, let's just say I prefer working with progressive farmers." He offered me a contract for weekly deliveries of organic vegetables, starting small but with potential for growth. The money wasn't huge, but it was steady income and validation that my methods worked. As I signed the papers, my hands trembled slightly. This was it, my first real step toward independence. Wells shook my hand and said, "I'll be watching your progress with interest. If you can scale up production while maintaining quality, we might have bigger opportunities down the road." After he left, I sat in my truck and called the one person who would understand. "Buck," I said when he answered. "It's Teddy. I got the contract." His whoops of joy echoed through the phone. "Knew you had it in you, kid. Your daddy's gonna have to eat his words now." Dad's reaction was everything I'd expected and worse. When word got back to him about my contract, he stormed over to the Henley place like a man possessed. "You're trying to ruin me," he shouted, his face red with rage. "You're my son. You should be helping me, not competing against me." I stood my ground, though my heart was pounding. "I offered to help for years, Dad. You called my ideas worthless. Because they are worthless. And now you're stealing food right out of my mouth." His voice cracked on the last words, revealing a vulnerability I'd never seen before. But I was past feeling sorry for him. The ranch hands were divided. Some remained loyal to Dad out of habit and fear, but others quietly supported me. Buck had started stopping by the Henley place after his shifts, offering advice and encouragement. Even some of Dad's longtime customers were asking questions about my operation. Word was spreading that the weak son had something different to offer. That night, Dad called a family meeting. Mom sat at the kitchen table wringing her hands while Dad paced like a caged animal. "This ends now," he declared. "Teddy will shut down his little garden and come back where he belongs." I woke up one morning to find my fence cut in 3 places and my irrigation lines slashed. 20 head of cattle from the neighboring property had wandered into my crops, trampling 2 weeks of growth. It wasn't an accident. The cuts were too clean, too strategic. Someone had done this deliberately. I spent the morning repairing damage and getting the cattle back to their proper pasture. The owner, Bill Thompson, was apologetic and offered to pay for damages. "Strangest thing," he said. "Never seen my fence cut like that before. Someone wanted those cows in your field." That afternoon, I installed a trail camera hidden in an old oak tree overlooking my property. If someone was sabotaging my operation, I'd catch them. 2 nights later, the camera captured exactly what I expected. A figure in dark clothes cutting fence wire under cover of darkness. The image was grainy, but the man's gait was unmistakable. Santoro Schwab, one of Dad's most loyal hands, the man who'd been with our family for 15 years. My heart sank as I watched the footage. This wasn't just some random act of jealousy. This was organized sabotage, and it led straight back to Dad. I confronted Dad in his office the next morning, laptop in hand. The surveillance footage played on the screen between us, showing Santoro clearly cutting my fence. Dad watched without expression, his weathered hands folded on his desk. "Well?" I said when the video ended. "What do you have to say about this?" He was quiet for a long time, staring at the frozen image on the screen. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat and defensive. "I never told Santoro to do anything to your property. But you didn't tell him not to, did you?" Dad's silence was answer enough. The man who'd raised me to value honesty and integrity had stood by while his employee sabotaged my work. "You just made me stronger," I told him, closing the laptop. "Every dirty trick you pull, every obstacle you put in my way, just proves that you're scared of what I'm building." His jaw tightened. "I'm not scared of anything." "Then why are you trying so hard to stop me?" I stood up and headed for the door. "From now on, Dad, we're not family. We're competitors. And I'm going to beat you at your own game." Word about the sabotage spread through the farming community faster than I'd expected. By the end of the week, 3 neighboring ranchers had stopped by to express their support and disgust at what had happened. The local farm supply store owner, Marty Crawford, pulled me aside during my weekly visit. "What your daddy did isn't right," she said quietly. "Man sabotages his own son's business, he's lost his way." The unexpected support felt good, but it also raised the stakes. I wasn't just fighting for my own success anymore. The community was watching, and they were choosing sides. People who'd known Dad for decades were questioning his character. Carson Wells called with news that lifted my spirits even higher. "I've been talking to our corporate office," he said. "They want to increase your contract. Can you handle twice the current volume?" I walked through my expanding operation, calculating capacity. With the additional income, I could hire help and expand cultivation. "I can handle it," I told him. "But I'll need to bring on workers." "Do whatever you need to do. Quality like yours is hard to find." As I hung up the phone, I realized something that made me smile. I was about to start hiring employees. The irony was delicious. 3 of Dad's best ranch hands showed up at my gate on Monday morning, hats in their hands and hope in their eyes. Buck led the group, followed by young Jeremiah Stevens and Jeff Morales. "We heard you might be hiring," Buck said. "Truth is, Teddy, working for your daddy ain't what it used to be. Man's gotten mean and desperate." Jeremiah nodded agreement. "He cut our hours last month, then blamed us when the cattle got sick. We've been thinking about making a change." Jeff spoke up in his quiet way. "Your daddy, he doesn't listen to new ideas. You do. We want to work for someone who respects what we know." Hiring them was easy. They already knew the land, understood livestock, and respected hard work. More importantly, they believed in what I was building. Dad lost 3 experienced workers in one day, and they came directly to me. When word reached him, his reaction was predictable. He called Buck personally, threatening to blacklist him from every ranch in the county. Buck just laughed. Let him try, he told me later. Man's reputation is mud already. Mine's solid. By the end of the week, I had a crew of 4 and plans to expand production. The Central Valley Agricultural Fair announced their annual innovation competition with a prize that made my heart race. The winner would receive a $50,000 development grant and a 5-year contract with a major food distributor. Applications were due in 2 weeks, and the presentation would be at the fair in front of judges and industry leaders. I stayed up 3 nights straight preparing my proposal. Sustainable ranching techniques, integrated technology, environmental impact reduction, everything I'd been implementing on a small scale, ready to be expanded. My presentation included soil analysis data, production comparisons, and financial projections that showed impressive returns on investment. When I submitted the application, my hands were shaking. This was my chance to prove that innovation could beat tradition. The competition would showcase operations from across 3 counties. Large established ranches with decades of history would be presenting alongside young farmers like me. The stakes couldn't be higher. 2 days after the deadline, I learned that Dad had also submitted an application. The local paper ran a story about the father-son competition, calling it a tale of 2 generations. The pressure was enormous, but so was the opportunity. Dad threw everything he had at preparing for the fair. I watched from across the valley as trucks delivered new equipment to his ranch. Tractors, feed mixers, irrigation systems, thousands of dollars worth of machinery that he couldn't afford. Buck, who still had friends on Dad's crew, brought me intelligence about the spending spree. He's mortgaged everything, Buck reported. Took a second loan against the ranch to buy all that equipment. He's betting it all on winning that contract. The desperation worried me more than Dad's anger ever had. A desperate man makes dangerous decisions, and Dad was clearly beyond rational thinking. His livestock looked stressed from overwork as he pushed them to perform beyond their limits. Cattle that should have been resting were being driven hard to show maximum productivity. I watched him work from dawn to past midnight, driving himself and his remaining workers to exhaustion. Mom called me twice that week, begging me to reconsider the competition. He's not sleeping, she said. He's not eating. This is killing him, Teddy. But I couldn't back down now. Too many people were counting on me, and Dad had made this personal when he chose sabotage over support. The morning with the scent of autumn in the air. My display booth showcased everything I'd learned about sustainable agriculture. Drone footage showed my irrigation systems in action. Soil samples demonstrated improved nutrient content. Charts compared my production efficiency to industry standards. The crowd response exceeded my expectations. Farmers stopped to ask detailed questions about my techniques. Agricultural extension agents took notes and requested copies of my data. A reporter from the regional farming magazine interviewed me about integrated pest management. Judge Lori Coleman, a respected agricultural scientist, spent 20 minutes examining my soil analysis. Impressive improvement in organic matter, she said. How did you achieve this level of enhancement in such a short time? I explained my composting methods and cover crop rotation, watching her nod approvingly. Judge Don Pike, representing the food distribution company, focused on my financial projections. Your cost per unit numbers are impressive, he said. But can you scale this up without losing efficiency? That's exactly what the grant would allow me to test, I replied. As the day progressed, my confidence grew. The judges seemed genuinely interested in my innovation-based approach to traditional farming. I arrived at the fair early the next morning to find my display destroyed. Someone had poured motor oil over my soil samples, torn down my charts, and smashed my laptop displaying the drone footage. Security footage from the overnight hours told the story I already knew in my heart. Dad, moving through the darkness with the stealth of guilt, systematically destroying my work. The guards showed me the clear video evidence. Dad approaching my booth at 2:17 a.m. Dad pouring oil from a container he'd brought specifically for destruction. Dad ripping my carefully prepared presentations to pieces. The betrayal cut deeper than any words he'd ever spoken. This wasn't competition anymore. This was warfare. Instead of calling the police, I made a different choice. I requested a meeting with all 3 judges and asked fair management to gather the crowd. Standing in front of 200 farmers, vendors, and industry professionals, I connected my laptop to the main screen. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to show you something about family values and sportsmanship. The surveillance footage played in complete silence. Gasps echoed through the crowd as they watched my father destroy his own son's work under cover of darkness. When the video ended, the silence was deafening. The crowd's reaction was immediate and brutal. Voices rose in anger and disgust as people processed what they'd just witnessed. "Shameful," someone shouted from the back. "That's his own boy." Judge Coleman's face was pale with shock. "Mr. Flores," she said, addressing Dad directly, "do you have an explanation for this behavior?" Dad stood frozen like a deer in headlights, his face cycling through expressions of denial, anger, and finally defeat. He opened his mouth twice but no words came out. The weight of public judgment pressed down on him like a physical force. "This is exactly the kind of backwards thinking that's holding agriculture back," Judge Pike said coldly. "Innovation requires trust and integrity. What we've seen here is neither." Fair management stepped in quickly, escorting Dad away from the crowd before things got uglier. His reputation was destroyed in 5 minutes of video footage. 30 years of standing in the community, gone. As people began to disperse, many stopped to shake my hand and express their support. "Son," said elderly Otis Fleming, a respected local rancher, "you've got more character than your daddy ever will. I'm proud to know you." The judges huddled together, but their decision seemed obvious. The question now was whether I could rebuild my presentation in time. The judges deliberated for 3 hours while I hastily rebuilt my presentation using backup files and materials from my truck. The farming community rallied around me in an incredible display of support. Vendors offered display materials, other competitors shared presentation equipment, and someone even brought a new laptop when mine couldn't be repaired. When the judges finally called everyone together for the announcement, my heart was hammering. Judge Coleman stepped forward with the results. This year's Innovation Award goes to Teddy Flores for his comprehensive approach to sustainable agriculture and his demonstration of character under adversity. The applause was thunderous. $50,000 and a 5-year distribution contract were mine. As I shook hands with the judges, Pike pulled me aside. "Son, what happened here today showed us more about your integrity than any presentation could have. We're proud to be working with you." The crowd lifted me up, literally, celebrating not just my victory but the triumph of decency over sabotage. As the celebration continued around me, I caught sight of Dad's truck leaving the parking lot, defeated and alone. I felt no joy in his humiliation, only sadness for what our relationship had become. But I'd proven my point beyond any doubt. Innovation and integrity had beaten tradition and sabotage. 3 weeks later, I was reviewing expansion plans in my temporary office when Buck came in with news that made my stomach drop. "Teddy, your daddy's ranch is in foreclosure. Bank's gonna auction everything next Friday." The equipment purchases for the fair had been the final straw. Combined with declining revenues and the loans he'd taken, Dad had leveraged himself into bankruptcy. The ranch that had been in our family for 3 generations was about to be sold to strangers. Mom called that evening, crying. "Teddy, I know things have been bad between you and your father, but we're losing everything. The house, the land, everything your grandfather built." I drove past the ranch that night, seeing the foreclosure notice posted on the front gate. Equipment sat idle in the yard, some already tagged for repossession. The cattle looked thin and stressed, victims of Dad's desperation and poor management. 4 ranch hands had been laid off, leaving only Santoro Schwab and 2 others to handle work that needed 8 men. It was a disaster decades in the making, accelerated by pride and poor decisions. As I sat in my truck looking at the place where I'd grown up, a plan began forming. Risky, expensive, but possible with my new contract and grant money. Dad stood on my porch on Thursday morning, his hat literally in his hands. The proud man who'd called me weak was broken, aged 10 years in the last month. "Teddy," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I need to ask you something." I let him into my kitchen, noticing how his clothes hung loose on his shrinking frame. Pride and stress had eaten him alive. "I need a job," he said, the words clearly causing him physical pain. "I know I don't deserve it after everything I've done, but I'm asking anyway." The moment I'd been waiting for had arrived, but it felt hollow. Victory without satisfaction. I poured 2 cups of coffee and sat across from him at my kitchen table. "Why should I hire you?" I asked. "You called me weak. You sabotaged my business. You tried to steal my contracts. Give me one good reason." He was quiet for a long time, staring into his coffee. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red with exhaustion and regret. "Because I was wrong," he said. "About everything. You're stronger than I ever was, smarter than I ever gave you credit for. I let pride and fear make me do terrible things." He paused, swallowing hard. "You'll work for me," I said finally. "But it'll be by my rules, my methods, my schedule. No arguments, no second guessing, no, that's not how we've always done it. Can you handle that?" Working under his son's authority was the hardest lesson Dad ever learned. I assigned him to fence repair and basic maintenance, jobs that kept him busy but away from decision-making. He grumbled at first, old habits dying hard, but gradually adapted to his new reality. Buck, now my foreman, supervised Dad's work with professional courtesy and just a hint of satisfaction. The other workers treated Dad with respect but no special deference. He was just another employee now, subject to the same rules and expectations as everyone else. Slowly, incredibly, Dad began to change. He watched my methods with growing interest instead of automatic dismissal. When I explained why we rotated grazing areas, he listened. When I showed him soil pH data, he asked questions. The man who'd refused to learn anything new for decades started taking notes. "Your grandfather would be proud," he told me one evening as we finished repairs on the south pasture. "Not of me, but of you. You saved something I was too stubborn to save myself." I'd purchased the family ranch at auction, keeping it in the family while modernizing every aspect of the operation. Within 6 months, productivity was up 40% and costs were down 20%. Success built on sustainable practices and respect for both land and workers. A year later, I stood in the same spot where Dad had publicly called me weak. The ranch was thriving under my leadership, with contracts worth 10 times what Dad had ever achieved. Modern equipment hummed efficiently across expanded acreage. Workers moved with purpose and pride, knowing their efforts were valued and their ideas heard. Dad approached me as I reviewed the quarterly reports, his step lighter than it had been in years. "Teddy," he said, "I owe you an apology that's about a year overdue." I looked up from my paperwork, seeing genuine humility in his weathered face. "I was wrong about everything," he continued. "Strength isn't about muscle or volume or doing things the way they've always been done. Real strength is vision, adaptation, resilience. You showed me that strength comes from building people up, not tearing them down." The ranch hands worked around us, a mix of old-timers and new hires, all united by shared respect and common purpose. In the distance, the latest cattle moved through rotational grazing areas, healthy and productive. "The day you told me I was too weak," I said, closing the folder, "was the day I became stronger than you could ever imagine. But you know what, Dad? There's room for both of us to be strong now." He smiled for the first time in months. "Yes, sir," boss. Yes, there is.